right, we have everybody, so we're going to get started. Thank you all for waiting and the packed audience. Today is the thesis defense for George Correr. He's actually my first bioengineering student, so I'm actually proud. Not that I'm also not proud of other departments too, but since bioengineering pays my bill, it's I think George joined my lab in my early stages of when we were building the lab, and this picture that we took at a maker fair, and you can see some familiar. Jim is there, Hurry is there, and at that time we were bold enough to talk about time travel equipment in the lab. And I think George not only brought his flair for caring for many of the challenges, problems in diagnostics, especially because of his perspective of growing up in Kenya itself, which has been a big part of the lab and the work we do, but he also really helped build the lab, so I'm very proud of this day. Over the years, we wrote our first patent, the first paper together, and then one time I was at an airport screening around some magazines, wasting some time, and popped out George on one of the front covers of the magazine, and billboards, and I think it's both it was a joy, and he's probably the only member of our lab who's been on the cover of a magazine. But in a more serious note, I think George has not only taken some of the technology work that he's been doing, he's traveled back to the field, back and forth, shared it with a very broad group of people that have both supported, was part of the inventors, college age, sharing some of his inventions with, that's George West, who invented the electret microphones, and this is Steve Davis, who's the head of PATH, one of the largest diagnostics organizations. And I think one of the things that I'm excited about that you'll all get a chance to hear is the path forward with all the things George has done and the things that are there to come. So with that, George Correr.
Thank you all for coming. I'm really honored that you're here today. Very excited to share what I've been up to the last several years in the Prakash Lab. So my focus is on punch-card programming, modular molecular diagnostics. But really, the story begins when we consider the world in general. In a world of more than 7 billion people, we have roughly 1 billion without access to roads, a lot of infrastructure, electricity, making it difficult for them to get access to even good healthcare, especially in these low-income countries. We still have a great burden of communicable diseases. The infectious diseases contribute to a lot of deaths annually. We know there's been also a rising of non-communicable diseases. Infectious diseases continue to really dominate in these. And as Manu mentioned, I'm from Kenya, and I grew up in Nakuru. And from my time in Kenya, I've had some personal experiences with some of these infectious diseases. I was quite a sickly child. In fact, my mother used to tease me that I didn't suckle enough. I got stronger as I grew up, and I like to think that I was able to catch up. But I guess I leave it up to you to figure out whether that's true or not. So I was inspired to find ways to address some of these challenges. My fellow countryman, Paul Ouma, published this study on access to emergency care on this magnificent continent, and looking at geocoded inventory of public hospitals across 48 countries. Turns out that from this spatial census, only a quarter of the countries were able to achieve this international benchmark of having more than 80% of the population living within 2 hours of a hospital. And our lab was able to see an example of this firsthand in one of our field sites in Madagascar, where in one area it would take 12 hours by journey foot to get to the next hospital. So I decided to focus on diagnostics, mainly because it's one of the key pillars of addressing some of these health disparities. And with appropriate diagnostics, you have the opportunity to have effective treatment, the patient, hopefully prevent or stop outbreaks, or at least mitigate some of the effects, and to help address some of the rising challenges of antimicrobial resistance. My focus specifically is on the last mile challenge. I'm interested in areas where there are no roads, no electricity, lack of infrastructure and very few resources, the limited resources to get to places. And this focus is on this approach is driven by a frugal science kind of approach that we take in general as a lab. And there have been other technologies that come out of the percussion lab, including the Foldscope, which has been scaled and reached to close to 1 million users since inception. And we work on different problems. And in working on this frugal approach to problems, we often think about the cost, but not at the sacrifice of performance. We still want a decent performance in building whatever solutions you're building for this area. And there have been multiple applications that we've worked on, but my focus is on diagnostics. In thinking of molecular diagnostics specifically, the process is basically in classical diagnostics. It entails, preparation of the sample, amplification of a target of interest, and being able to detect and maybe record the data. And when you look at the parts, we saw that they're very modular in nature, and you could look at it as ways in which you could break it down to individual components. And we thought of why don't we look at this as a series of modules that you could build upon each other, where you could address this challenge in a fashion that with time you could add functionality, complexity and versatility, by making it more complex in a fashion that the user could choose what they want in the approach that we take. So I'll share this work and how we went about this. And some of this work has been published, and some of it is also in preparation. And my story really begins when I got to get paid to get home to do some myth finding. And I spent some time visiting 12 healthcare facilities, interviewing 48 different people in all over the country, across different tiers, from the clinics in the rural areas all the way to the tier 6 hospital in the national hospital, to try and really understand the context, to try and know some of the tools that are already available and some of the diseases that we could target as we move forward. And some of the things that was clear for me is that microscopy still remains the workhorse of diagnostics. Often you would find a microscope placed close to a window where there's plenty of light. And you would find also rapid diagnostic tests. These are lateral flow assay based tests. They're relatively inexpensive, and they've been subsidized by the government as well. I found that often when a patient comes in with a fever, there's often 2 tests available. The first is malaria diagnostic, where they do a blood smear to figure out whether or not the patient has the disease. And the second is a typhoid test. It's a serologic test looking at the antibodies. But this test, it turns out, it has a lot of cross-reactivity. And the people using the reagents know this, but often they still use it because of the limited resources that they have. They will still do the test. I also noticed that there are players, both government players and also non-governmental organizations, that contribute in helping keep costs low. One of which is the USAID, here at the bottom, this side. These are blood smears of HIV positive patients, and one of the patient care management entails measuring the viral load on a regular basis to see how well the patient. This is done by a courier service to a centralized facility, Walter Reed Medical Army Center in Kericho, Kenya, and then the results are faxed back to the center where they're shared with the patient. Then on that corner is a molecular-based diagnostic platform built by CPD in Menlo Park, and it's highly subsidized by the Global Fund because it's targeting resistant tuberculosis. And I found that in Kenya, there's 47 of these instruments, one for each county in a country of 50 million people. And they're still, each test is still relatively expensive at $10 a test. For a population which lives on less than $2, a majority of which less than $2 a day, is still quite steep. And this is highly subsidized. The tool itself is subsidized such that the country only pays $17,000, which is 20% of the cost of the tool. So basically, what was clear is that cost is a very important factor. At the same time, there's also the idea of complexity and having a robust test. So we see that as the cost, as the complexity of the assay increases, the cost rises as well. But to an extent that's beyond the reach of the people who need it the most. So we saw the opportunity of where we could still keep the cost low while not sacrificing the complexity of the assay. Ultimately, we envisioned that device that could fit in this pack carried by this gentleman in the Congo is a community healthcare worker who was able to reach the farthest areas in a device that could fit there and be able to get to the point of need, the patient. And in doing this, we carried this design approach based on the WHO's recommendation or criteria for diagnostics for resource-limited settings. It has the acronym ASSURE, A being that it has to be affordable, it has to be sensitive, specific, it has to be user-friendly, it has to be robust and rapid, it has to be used in emergent conditions, and also has to be easily deliverable to the places where it's needed. So tonight I'm going to share this, and I'll focus on three main things. The first part will be a new way we came up with for conducting electricity-free programmable microfluidics. Next, I will show you how we broadened this platform and built additional modules on top of it in order to enable robust diagnostics. And finally, I'll share a species-specific malaria diagnostic assay that I designed and implemented on this modular molecular platform. So, in thinking of microfluidics, for those who are familiar with it, there's often essentially two main paradigms, or a fork on the road. On the one hand, we have these classical microfluidic platforms where often you have this very tiny chip, very inexpensive chip, but it's supported by a lot of machinery, all this tubing, making it extremely expensive and not as portable. So we end up with this phenomenon of having a chip in the lab, although there's the often touted lab on a chip. On the other hand, we have the paper diagnostics. These are based on capillary-based driven flows, probably the size of a stamp. Beautiful invention, very inexpensive, and excellent way of doing certain assays, very specific assays. The challenge is that it's very limited programmability, kind of samples that you could handle, and can be used for very specific applications. So we envisioned a world where maybe we could have the best of these two worlds. And in that, we got inspired by this idea that's been around since the 18th century of punch card programming. And this key inspiration, took us to the Jacquard loom. He's a Frenchman, Joseph Jacquard. He invented this loom for textiles, whereby by programming using punch cards, you're able to come up with new patterns without having to redesign the entire system. So it really simplified textile manufacturing. In fact, this image down here was made, it's a portrait of Jacquard himself, and it was made by punch cards, made to order, printed in silk. It looks like a digital printer, but it's an actual textile made in the 18th century. This idea was so powerful that it inspired Charles Babbage. In fact, he ordered one of these portraits, and it was found in his home. And in looking at some of his findings, some of the things that he left in Turin, Italy, one of the things that jumped out was this punch card code that he wrote. And he used this idea to build the analytical engine, which is the precursor to modern day computers. And we've seen this idea also elsewhere, in terms of radio telescopes and the music world and so many other areas where this idea still permeates and continues on. And we hope to bring it back to today and applying it to music, chemistry. Who here has used punch cards to program? Well, ladies and gentlemen, these are the people you look to for wisdom. And so, if you worked in Stanford in the 50s and you needed to work, use the computation center, you'd have to also use, the punch card programs, because this is one of Stanford's punch cards. Anyway, so, yeah, it led us to wonder, can we use punch cards to program chemistry? And the answer is yes, otherwise I wouldn't be standing here. I'm going to share exactly how we did that. And our inspiration is a music box. Who here has played with a music box? Yeah, much better. I won't tell you what to look out for, what to go to for. But I'm going to go go on and tell you how exactly this works in a lot of detail. But this video just shows a good old music box with its toy, someone playing with it. And onto it is coupled a microfluidic chip. I'll share exactly how it works and how we use it as an idea. So this is a side view of the device in action. At the bottom is the punch card tape. And at the very top is a microfluidic chip. At the background, where it's focused, is a module for valving. So what happens is whenever there's a punch hole, each of these gears turns individually. It turns once, in a one-to-one mapping.
What's the scale?
The scale, this spacing is 2 centimeters, actually 2 millimeters, sorry.
2 millimeters.
From here to here is 2 millimeters. Some of the scale bars disappeared, but anyway, pardon me. So that's 2 millimeters from here to here. And so in thinking of fluidics, you have to think of mainly two main things. We have to think of how can you pump fluids, how can you control this using valves, and a series of instructions to do this. And that's what we do with this punch card code. I'm going to walk you through each of those key things that we use with the music box to do the fluidics on chip. So beginning with pumping, it begins with the punched card tape. As it's reeled through with the gears, whenever there's a hole, each of these gears gets caught up and it turns once. And as it turns once, it acts on a microfluidic chip that's lowered to a height that can interact with the gear. So it turns in an arc. And when it turns, it closes the channel completely. And as it turns all the way around, it ejects a fluid plug forward downstream in the direction opposite to the punch card tape. And so here's a top-down video of the same, where, as you see, this is 1.2 millimeters across the reservoir, and you have 6 channels going through, and with each pumping action, you have fluid being pumped to the reservoir. So we characterized this, and we found that the flow is pulsatile in nature, as shown in the chymographs on that side. And this is because of the elastic material that we use to make these microfluidic chips. So every time the pumping action, there's a bit of a recoil in the material leading to that pulsatile flow. The second factor is we're able to achieve up to a maximum of less than 2 microliters per minute. As you can imagine, it's relatively low, but I'm going to share with you later how we ramped it up for molecular diagnostic assays. So the second aspect, we found that with microfluidics, when you consider the length scales, with the Reynolds number being low, mixing is quite a challenge. And so in order to do that, traditionally people have built structures within the chip to encourage that chaotic mixing. And so we find that with our tool, if you have a zigzag pattern and that pulsatile effect or nature of the pumping, you end up getting enhanced mixing. Because with this pulsatile nature, you end up having fluid streams folded upon each other, thereby minimizing the distance across which diffusion occurs. So you end up with enhanced pumping. And this was characterized in our initial paper. And the picture here shows the same flow rate, but using syringe pumps, and we see that you will have laminar flow without mixing across the channels. But with the pulsatile flow, we have enhanced mixing. So that was a very important feature when you're thinking of acids that require mixing on chip. So the next aspect is the valves. So the valves work using the same gearing mechanism, where whenever there's a punched hole, it turns once, but this time it essentially plugs this cantilever beam. And as it moves down, the gear, which is always closing the channel, moves downward and forward in that action. And then it springs back to close the channel again. So we're able to characterize this and found that once the channel is open, it's about 100 milliseconds before it springs back shut again. So the next feature that we're able to build on the device is a droplet generator. And why do we care about droplets? It turns out if you partition reaction reagents into many droplets and have amplification in each of these droplets, you essentially have microreactors where you could have if you have a few target molecules in the bulk solution, each of those can have its own reaction, and thereby if you detect them by fluorescent base means, it could have a very good essentially amplification effect which of a rare molecule which would otherwise be lost in the dilution if you just did the bulk solution. That's why droplet-based assays are being pushed as the next frontier in PCR and those kinds of amplification techniques. What we have as a droplet generator, it works in the same way as a valve, the same valving mechanism. What's different is just the microfluidic chip. So the design is such that you have a water-based solution in the middle, and it's surrounded by oil-based solutions on the other side. So every time this valving action happens, this plucking action, it springs open and then it taps on the channel. And when it taps on the channel, there's an injection of a fluid, which is carried downstream as a droplet. I'm going to show you a video of this, and it's in real time. The channel width is 200 microns to get a sense of this. So this is a top-down view, and as you can see, every time there's that tap, you have an ejection of the droplet, and there's a dynamic instability at this junction, which results in that breakoff, and then it goes downstream all the way. So we characterize this, and we got a one-to-one mapping with droplets on the size of 2.5 nanoliters for this particular geometry, and that could be changed with a different geometry of a different chip. And if you look at classical droplet generators, the droplets are on the order of 10 nanoliters, and there are some on the order of 10 picoliters. But the way they're generated is through a very carefully controlled tuning of the flow rate, very precise tuning of the flow rates, in order to get these droplets, sometimes with varying shapes, and it's all shear based. What we have here, to the best of our knowledge, is a fast handheld programmable on-demand droplet generator, which you could use and generate without electricity for your assays. Now that we had our building blocks working, we decided to implement a first very simple test case of a water quality test. And this water quality test is for elements that one would measure if you're doing aquaculture, because you want to make sure, for instance, that if your ammonia is too high, your fish die. So you want to monitor that and make sure that everything is. So we looked at the pH, the ammonia, nitrates, and nitrites, and we used the reagents that are available as a kit, compared our results against the kit results that we mix just in bulk. So on the left-hand side are the kit results, and on the right-hand side are the readouts from the outlets of our device, which is here, which we designed to mix these reagents in the same ratio. And by using our device, we also use much fewer reagents because of their volume being run quite low. So I'm going to share now this second part on how we built on this. But before that, I just want to highlight that with our device, with this fast prototype, we're able to have 15 pumps and 15 independently addressable valves at a cost of roughly $5. And to put it in context, for microfluidic kind of pumps, each of them goes on the order of $100 or more, and valves are easily $50 or more. So the cost fraction part is quite dramatic when we think of classical microfluidic pumps and valves. And so we went on to design twice the bandwidth of our first platform. And with these 30 channels, we were able to move forward for the next phase of the design. But before I go into the chips in depth, I want to share with you the design principles for designing each of these chips, in case any of you wants to, build your own later, because that's what we're hoping for. So think of it as a chip design template, as just a blank sheet of paper with a few areas where you have to do certain things, but you're free to do whatever you want anywhere else on that paper. So you have to cognizant where the pumps are and where the valves are, because with that location you have the punch card tape that's going to tell these gears to turn and act on the chip itself. So as you draw it, you have to draw that if you want pumping, your line will be aligned to the pump area. But if you want to route the channel back or do other things, you're free to do so in the spacing in between. And so here you could have one chip that has 6 pumps maximum to do one thing, or 0 to 30 pumps on the other end. And so there's that mapping between the punch card code and the design that you make itself. So there are also other building blocks in terms of the number of inputs you can play with. These are just single input designs, and here's multiple inputs, all of which go into a reservoir and the corresponding code that is required to run them. And then on the other hand, general purpose mixers, because mixing is quite key in terms of different biochemical assays. And so with these different blocks, you could just put them together and knit them together as you will for your particular assay, and you end up with your chip. I'll share how we did that for a malaria-based chip later on. And so this process required a lot of iteration, not just on the chip itself, but also the device. And I like to look at this as, this is my graveyard or museum. But this is the number of iterations that you had to go through for some of these designs. And the same was in the case of chips. I used to look at all the chips I've made and think that, what if I just took a picture? Maybe it would be enough for a PhD. So now that we have a tool, Elizabeth, one of our team members, took a trip to Tanzania to do some validation of some of these needs and get some of the additional feedback, and just kind of see, the interaction with the user of the tool and see what you could learn from that. And also just see what other needs she could find. And she found that just like in Kenya, there were some needs, limited resources, and lots of people that she met, like I did, who have so many ideas, brilliant people, so many ideas. If they had the right tools, they'll be diving into all their research ideas. And so there's this common thread of a lack of tools. So we thought of this modularity as a design principle in making these tools. Because modularity lends itself well to biochemical assays, because each of these steps can be carried in multiple ways. And so when choosing a set of modules, one can conduct a specific assay of interest. And so, and the advantages with modularity obviously lies in this customizable aspect. But then there's also cost benefits, because if someone could have certain modules, depending on what they need as well, and if certain modules are made at scale, it's just a matter of picking, instead of having a very customizable one device that does one thing. And we also envision a community of developers and could hopefully build or develop from this, so that we could enable more people to build more of these modules in an open space, to lower this barrier eventually, and to get more users involved or making for their own applications. And this concept of a modular design, it's been used in the rockets, in the Apollo mission rocket, also Google's Project Ara. And with this, we find that with the different designs and the different approaches, some of these modules are still being reused, even though there have been some catastrophic failures with some of the rockets. But the idea of modularity has stayed on in the making of the additional rockets. So I'm going to go about and share how we did this modular approach for our platform, starting with the punch card-driven microfluidic device as a core. We built upon it additional modules, one being an optical module, and the second being just a computational module to control everything. And within each module, there are elements that are interchangeable as well. And so that's the picture of the final device. So in looking at addressing biochemical assays, one of the key things that I mentioned was the relatively flow rate of our first prototype. So that was the first thing that we wanted to address in order to be able to do these assays in a timely fashion. So The first easy thing was to give it a more powerful motor. Because when thinking of the fundamentals of the pumping, it's how often you do it, how much you do it every time, and the volume you do it whenever you do it. So those three key factors that came from the first study. The second one is re-examining the gear series. So if you look at the default gear, each gear tooth is 450 microns wide, and the spacing in which it rotates is 700 microns. So as you can imagine, there's a bit of a play whenever it's turning, leading to inefficiencies when it's coupled into the channels itself. So even if the channels are perfectly aligned, if there's that play, you end up with these inefficiencies affecting the flow rate. And so to address that, we made additional gears of different weights in order to cover the channel entirely. So the other aspect is valving, which I've explained how it works. I'm going to show you a video of this in action. So this right here are the valves, and you have the pumping happening. So the top-down view, as you can see, whenever there's a hole punch card tape and going underneath, the gears turn once, and then pumping occurs. And as you can see, there is a mismatch of timing between pumping and valving. It's such that pumping happens, and then valving just opens at the very last minute. So that led to inefficiencies in the flow rate as well as the pumping itself. So to address that, we changed this single parameter H. When H is 0 at the initial default setting, when the pump is on, the valve is off, which is not good. So moving it up 1 millimeter, there's a bit of an overlap. But when H is 1.5, it's much better. But we found a sweet spot at 2 millimeters where we find that the valve opens just before pumping begins and stays open right until pumping ends for it to close. That's what we took on as a final design. Now, combining all these different elements, we implemented it on chips of different parameters, and we were able to get a 50-fold increase in the flow rate, with the best setting being at a chip that's wide, 625 microns wide, being covered by a 630 micron channel gear tube.
Was the channel depth the same as the width?
Not at all. The depth remains at 50 microns.
Okay.
So the only parameter we change is the width. I'll now share with you a different element of this, which is the fabrication of the chip itself. This was a new contribution to the making of the devices, and I'll share with you why. The first being that our mechanism is such that we're relying on the squeezing of flexible channels. So we need a solid substrate against which this will happen. So for that, we built an acrylic body. The second part is we want to be able to run volumes of different volumes on chip without necessarily running the same volume of reagents. And so now to get that concentration effect and be able to run large volumes if we desire, introduce a idea of embedding glass microfiber matrix membrane on chip. I'll show you how we did that. And the second aspect, or the third aspect, is just the interplay between classical fabrication with wafers, and then adding on top of that plastic micromolds through which you could transfer features onto the chip in order to have features, let's say, on the ceiling of the device, or be able to do multiple layers of the chip making process, or the chips that you end up making. In looking at the membrane inclusion, these are all like sealed on chip, and this enables the capturing of the DNA within the matrix. So this is a glass fiber, microfiber matrix, and it's chitosan treated. And it's such that at low pH, the DNA gets bound to it, but you could also release the DNA, if you will, by sending in a high pH solution. So having that made, we then moved on to the next modules, and the first being lysis for sample preparation. And for that, we use a thermolysis approach. That's their platform was made and worked on by Ethan, who's here in the audience. For that, we're able to get temperature control, and it gets to the set point of 90 Celsius that we're going for in less than 5 minutes. And another module that we added on is for the isothermal experiments that we were running, and we just use a off-the-shelf self-regulating heater to keep the temperature at 40 degrees Celsius. The third module is it's an optical module. This module features 3 Raspberry Pi off-the-shelf cameras that are fitted with an emission filter that's cut to size to keep the cost low. That just covers the camera lens. And then line lasers that can cover the entire chip. And the imaging is such that you could image the entire chip at once. And so you get uniform illumination from these lasers. And we chose 3 so that you'd be able to have 3-channel fluorescent-based imaging for your assays. This is just an example of the image you get from this optical module in an assay. And one of the key things that popped out from this initial experiment is sometimes you have bubbles that could mess with your experiment. So, but there are ways to deal with those. But if anyone has worked in microfluidics, you know bubbles are the enemy. So the other aspect is a control module, but we use a Raspberry Pi module, just off the shelf, inexpensive computation, to control everything on chip. So I'm going to go on to the last part, which is the disease we chose, and that's malaria, because it remains a killer, where there have been more than 200 million cases, 90% of which are in Africa, more than 400,000 deaths, most of which are children under the age of 5. And there's a big push toward elimination in 21 countries by 2020. And this parasite requires a mosquito vector, and it has different cycles occurring in the body. And it's such that you have to know which parasite you have, because some of them have a dormant cycle that resides in the liver, the ovale and the vivax. So these hypnozoids leads to a recurring, if they're not treatment, you could have recrudescence of the pathogen. Those are different in terms of incubation periods and all these other things, and how they're treated and the medication required. So it's important to know what species a person is infected with. The other development with malaria is there's a new vaccine in town. There's a pilot program in Malawi last week, and there'll be additional key pilot tests in Kenya and Ghana later on. And what's key about this is it only has a 39% efficacy, but it's taken a long time to develop, and it's such that given the lack of available options, they decided it's better to just do it. You may save tens of thousands of people, and it requires 4 doses as well. So overall, malaria remains a problem. It's still an open challenge, and we've started seeing this plot by WHO that there's been a rise of cases recently, and the key things that people are talking about, some of the drivers of this is the vector insecticide resistance. We have gene deletions in the pathogen. So this soon reached protein 2 gene for Plasmodium falciparum. It's a target for some of the mostly used rapid diagnostic tests. So a person may show up negative, but could be just a gene deletion, so you're missing that. And then there's drug resistance coming up, even in the frontline drugs. So it's an urgent problem. So here we have the standard diagnostics, what's used right now. Rapid diagnostic tests, inexpensive, but with varying degrees of sensitivity and specificity, and still expensive, so they're still subsidized. Microscopy, the gold standard, but it requires a very well-trained microscopist, and doesn't quite catch the lowest sense of in terms of the copy numbers per microliter. So I think you have to be very skilled to even get below 100. And then molecular-based diagnostics. In talking to the person who was in the team in Kenya for doing the country task force in terms of the planning, they use that only for surveillance because of the costs associated with it. So overall, it's very expensive to have this used on that scale. So yes, malaria remains a problem, and RDTs, though mostly used miss a lot of the cases, as in this case in the Vietnam, where 68% of the people were infected, but the test only caught 4 or 5% of this. And so we decided to go for it using recombinant polymerase amplification. And this is an enzymatic-based process that uses 3 enzymes, recombinase polymerases and a single-strand binding protein. It's isothermal, so there are few energy requirements in doing the assay. And also the reagents come in lyophilized form, so they don't need refrigeration. And they're very handy for being used on the field side. And so for that, I designed the primers sequences using the genes that were able to be shown to be able to differentiate between the species, in addition to one that covers all the species. And after testing those, I was able to design the probes. So all of them worked on the bulk solution, and after having all of them worked, moved on to do some of these tests like a limit of detection assay for falciparum, and found that without perturbing the reaction, we get something on the order of tens of copies as a limit. Well, the manufacture of the reagents requires stirring and other ways of preserving it if the copy numbers are low, but we just decided to run it as we would potentially run our device while minimizing this kind of equipment. So, as I've shown you how we have our lysis platform. So we looked at the performance of this extraction on our platform compared to a QIAGEN blood and tissue standard kit, and found that initially we were doing relatively poorly. But by changing the final lysis reagent, instead of using the recommended equal lysis buffer to sample volume, by using a quarter of that, we ended up with a concentration effect, where you ended up with much higher DNA in the concentration. I'll be happy to go into more depth if you have any questions on that particular way of doing things. But this is the design for the malaria chip. And this version is for the fully automated version. And with this, I'm going to shed some light on how the extraction process goes. So there's a kit for centrifugation-free diagnostics from QIAGEN. And there are 2 main steps: an enrichment step, where you add your blood to this enrichment solution with functionalized magnetic beads. You pump out that enrichment solution to get rid of some of the impurities by holding onto the cells with a magnet. Then you add on the lysis buffer. There's a dilute lysis buffer. Apply the heat for the thermolysis step, and then DNA is in solution. So this is the lysis buffer that you could play with. If you put it at a lower volume, you end up with more of the DNA in solution from that concentration effect. And now envision like if you had the master mix already pre-patterned on chip, all you need to do is just pump down the DNA in solution. And that's the punch card code that goes with this particular design. But before that, we went with a simpler chip that would just require, just pumping a single step reaction to do our initial assays. And so this is a video of all 5 assays. And if you can see, there is green fluorescence. It turns fluorescence upon getting a positive signal at those particular targets. I did another run where it was just blood. It's a negative control without anything else. And then one in which we spiked malaria-infected red blood cells, which you put that final video itself. So we're able to get that working. I must insist that this data is still on the relatively early stages, and there's additional studies to be done, additional work, tests to really characterize the system. Recently, we also got a patient sample from the Desiree Ebola for a patient infected with malaria, Plasmodium malariae, one of the species, and we're able to get a positive signal. But I must say that there's more to be done in terms of confirmation and really comparing against other systems. And so hopefully with more samples, we'll be able to do that. So this is part of that ongoing work. And one of the key things is, thinking of scaling and manufacturing and addressing that. And then a clinical validation plan, where we will, first of all, do additional tests with more samples in the lab. and potentially asking for some from the foundation of the new diagnostic sample bank before running this test in the field in Msambweni, Kisumu, where the Logo Lab has a site, and then Madagascar perhaps, and comparing everything against microscopy and PCR approaches. So there's much more to be done in validating the clinical model. Then there's the other vision of sharing this tool with the community. And we're thinking of a modular diagnostic website to make it openly accessible, and hopefully kind of make it such that people will be able to, at some point, develop modules and build, and kind of learn from each other. And in doing this platform, I'm thinking not just for diagnostics, but more broadly for educational based. Yeah. So therein lies my story. Maybe if there's a question before we do that.
Yeah, why don't do you want to do acknowledgements first, or okay? Why don't we do some questions? Take one or two questions from the audience, then we'll do the acknowledgement, and then after that we'll do the closed door session. So, any questions? Yes.
Very nice presentation. Thank you for making it understandable. You talked about the cost of pumps and chips. What about the whole device? What's the cost to get started with a system like this? Do you have an estimate?
So that's a good question. We think of it as a range from the no frills hand crank powered platform to the all battery powered, all the bells and whistles. So for that, the larger device, we're thinking on the order of 500. However, that's not been ironed out in terms of, this is just thinking of off the shelf, what's out there. By once scaling up and manufacturing is done, that'll be a different number. But when you think of costs, I think a big driver will be the reagents themselves. So by minimizing reagents, we're hoping that the end user would have less. But the initial cost will be for something that could be reused for multiple things.
Hey, George. Could this be commercialized for field water testing?
Absolutely, I see that application being very valuable. It's one of the things we actually considered as well in our initial work. At the end of the day, I think there would have to be kind of a deeper dive in terms of analyzing the viability. But as a technology itself, it's definitely can do it. It's a generic platform.
Any last question?
How robust is this system? So if you were to repeat your experiments in the lab, I can imagine all of these pumps and valves pretty variable. Or how do you characterize that?
We've characterized different elements. For instance, the volume, the flow rates across the different channels, and we found that for certain settings that variability is relatively low. But in thinking of running assays, we would make it such that for a particular step, it's run until the entire row of reagents are used up before the next step commences. So even if there's a timing mismatch, you could still have the reaction completed step by step. And the other aspect is, yes, the reagents will be in the particular ratio for the particular reaction. So even if there are variabilities, that will be handled. I must say that this is just a prototype. I mean, there's still a lot of manufacturing. There's still a lot of optimization to be done. There's still a lot of designs to look at, the right kind of tolerances for the repeatability. So at this point, yes, there's still variations, but in the future device, I think they will be minimized and maybe systems built within to be able to handle those kinds of issues.
Okay, so let's do the acknowledgements,
Yes.
and then we'll do closed door session.
I privilege of working with these remarkable people over the years, working on different phases of the design, coming in at different points. I'm extremely grateful because each person brought in a really fresh look on ways of doing things. Brace here was able to really solve the problem they're having for years on how am I going to scale up the chip making process. He came up with a very ingenious way where he turned my system upside down. I thought it would not work, but he made it work. For that, I'm really grateful. And we have Ethan, who came in, was excellent with the programming and building of the optical and thermal systems and characterizing all that. I'm really grateful. Also in line with that would be Hong Chuan. He came up with the design for the optical system and is a microscopy guru of the lab. So if you have any optics problems, he's the man you want to talk with. Hazel came in with the assay making, and it was really great to have these really good assay hands and getting that working as well. And of course, Matt, who's very hands-on and very valuable in all these areas, especially in the optics arena and processing of the images as well. I worked with Matthew when he was a high school student, and he redesigned the card, making it possible for manufacturing this device on a larger scale while we focus on manufacturing. Matthew briefly as well on the assays in the early stage. And then Ben and Elizabeth were really key in the product design phase, the early phase, really turning projects from the Amazon off-the-shelf thing that I bought and used the hacksaw to open up to a tool that could actually become a product eventually. So I'm really grateful for that work they did in the early stages. And along with this, I've worked with different labs. The Desiree, the Bohr lab, which I'm really grateful. I'm also getting some patient samples, visited their site in Kenya. Just extremely grateful. A big thanks to Elise and Garja for getting us the samples as well, the patient samples recently. And I've also worked with the Yale lab for getting the malaria-infected red blood cells. Extremely grateful for Marta, Stephanie, and Katrina, who are always very generous with these cells and normalize whole blood whenever I would need them. And there have been other labs as well. The Reggie Das lab as well, to work with, and the Pinsky lab and the Dunn lab are good neighbors. Brian lab as well. So thanks to you and Ria. I used a lot of your microfluidics reagents. I promise I always return them. Thank you. And Kiara as well. I want to thank my committee. I'm really grateful for all 6 of you. Thank you, Vivian, for joining my committee and include the RINA committee. It's a relatively last minute, but more importantly, I remember the many times you stop by the lab and I would be working over the weekend, and you drop pearls of wisdom. One of which was write the dissertation title and do nothing else that does not contribute to that title. I think that really helped me focus. A big thanks to Reggie. It was great meeting your lab as well and seeing your work and spending the day brainstorming with your assays. And we really look forward to moving forward with additional collaborations between our labs as well. And Desiree, thank you for being an extraordinary mentor, someone I would always confide in, for guiding me. And so many times we've met together and reaching out to your network. Whenever I needed anything, within the hour of meeting, you had sent 10 emails and I already had answers before walking out. So I'm really grateful for that, for always having my back. I really thank you for that. And Will, thank you so much. You embody excellence. It's such a great honor to have you as the chair of the committee. It's been great knowing you from when you were Stanford undergrad, and now you're chairing my committee. You never know what you'll meet. So thank you. And for your friendship, we know to continue moving forward. Paul, thank you so much. You're one of the reasons I came to Stanford. I don't know if you know that, but once you published the biodesign book, I was still at Hopkins. I read it within 2 weeks. I wrote you an email, and you actually responded within 24 hours. I was so impressed. And beyond that, I've just seen you running your team with excellence and humility, and just doing incredible work, sharing what you've learned from your mentors and spreading it all over the world and impacting multiple patients all over the world. For that, I'm grateful and really honored to have you on the team as well. So, the next is Manu. when I think of Manu, just like a lot of you, think of the genius that we all know him to be. And beyond that, he's a consummate scientist, but also a really, a world explorer. He has a generous heart, and a passion for impacting the world in many incredible ways. And it's been such an honor to have you as my advisor, and I thank you for letting me in your lab. And one of the things about Manu is that he dresses up from time to time. He is dressed up as a full scope. Anyway. And he seriously, I missed that dance party in Puerto Rico, but I hope next time I'll be able to do it. So when joining the lab, I wasn't sure what I was signing up for, and I'm so glad that I did. And we've had crazy discussions, ranging from crocodile skins, zombie ants, to ideas about making Frankenstein flies, to bubbles, dancing droplets, trichoplaques, so many more. I find that, I've been exposed close to much more than I bargained for. But I thank you for taking a chance on me. I thank you for your generosity and for sharing with me your passion for global health. So I look forward to continuing this journey with you. And as you always say, this is just the beginning. So yeah, there have been multiple people at Stanford whom I'm really grateful for. Ben Barris, late, he was also a key advisor. I remember in my third year when things were a bit rough. I was quite lost in the weeds, trying to make my way through, and I went to Ben and he gave me a lot of excellent advice. From that meeting, I was really fired up and ready to push on the next move. And Lori, thank you so much for supporting us in the Masters of Medicine program. Through Stanford, I've had incredible joy of being involved with biodesign as a graduate student. Incredible team, incredible group of people, and I'm really grateful for them. And of course, with biodesign, we had Anurag and Christine, who also work in the lab as well. We're working on the global team. On the Stanford Bioengineering, I'm grateful for Katie as well. She's been very instrumental this last few days, getting me to this place. And I want to give a special mention to Olga Lydia. I'm really thankful to you. From the very first day I joined the department, how you always treat us with so much care. You're someone I could always go to. I'm really grateful for your support all these years. So it's such an honor to have you here, and I'm really grateful. And there have been other people in Stanford as well. And I'm going to highlight Lakshmi Jawar is an incredible machinist. He helped me with machining really neat things over the years, and I would just walk to the shop and have a chat, and he would get working on something for me. Really grateful for him. And Noel Lozano as well, who really helped me, especially in the initial stages, even with the funding for my graduate school work, and getting me reassured that I will always have funding. I should never worry about that. If nothing else worked, I would always go to him. I'm grateful for the Bracazons. I'm really grateful for all the support and all your help. It's been really neat to have your help for the people I could always count on for different things. Incredible set of people, really brilliant on working on so many things. I'm grateful for my friends and the Calfa and Sequoia families. A big shout out to Benny back there and Big Mike, who are in my tribe, and they, Pastor Glenn and other people in the Stanford community as well, who've really supported me throughout these years. And a huge thanks to my family. I come from a wonderful big family. Charles, Victor, Stella, Rosemary, Sammy. Sometimes I'm like, can I remember all the names? It's always a good commentary until I don't remember. Thanks a lot. And of course my family in Wisconsin as well. The Liskies. It's going nice fishing in Wisconsin. Without my family, I would not be here. And I want to dedicate my dissertation work to my mother, who lived a life serving patients and showed me this life of service while raising 8 incredible children, working as a nurse in rural Kenya. So her legacy lives on, and I hope to keep doing her proud. Last but not least, is my wife, Holly, right at the corner, asante sana mpenzi wangu. I really appreciate all your support and for your endless supply of fresh bread and all the good stuff. There's so much more. Thank you for being an incredible partner. She's also a PhD holder, so she's my consultant. She's my secret weapon, I always say. So whenever I'm stuck on somewhere, I brainstorm with her. Whenever I'm frustrated, she's the person I will tell. She's a very solid, someone I look up to in many ways. So, that's it. Thank you very much.
So we'll move to the closed door part of the exam. Jordy, if you want to take a 2-minute break back from anybody wants to.
And I must add that afterwards there's also a celebration of our home in 2049 Overlane. You're all welcome.
How are you? Good. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, you're looking
happy and
congratulations. I didn't get to stick around after defense, but it was a wonderful talk.
Thank you so much for coming.
Oh,
It was
my
awesome
pleasure.
to have you.
It was an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you. Enjoy the closed door session.
See you later. Hi, you're Desiree?
Yeah.
Meet you now. Yeah, so many moving parts. Literally. Pretty awesome.
This is good, man. How are you?
I wish you the awesome
I'm Fabian.
biochemistry.
Yes.
Great to meet you.
Yeah. Which department are you in?
Biochemistry.
Oh, yes. Okay.
That's
Thank
why I
you
was
for
late.
making it.
I did tell George. I was
Yeah,
teaching,
no,
so
but
was
I didn't realize it.
Oh, you didn't realize that?